this is Oxford Castle Mound in Oxford in England, and then the other way behind us is Oxford Castle.
The castle was originally built for the usual reason that you build castles, but when its military value lessened, it started to be used as a prison. It is now owned by a private company, and you can only go around it on a guided tour of Oxford Castle and Prison, but it's well worth doing. I did it for my 40th birthday, so here is me getting pilloried for my 40th birthday. Stocks, incidentally, is the version where you have your ankles trapped between two planks of wood. This is a pillory, which is where it's your head and wrists that are trapped between two planks of wood. I really enjoyed the tour, so I highly recommend it. It's an excellent way to spend your 40th birthday. There are also so many ghosts and ghost stories surrounding the castle and the prison that you can not only go on a ghost tour specifically, I did the regular guided tour, but they do a specific ghost tour, you can also hire it out for your own paranormal investigations and do your own ghost hunt. There are that many ghosts in this castle. It's probably not surprising, I suppose, considering that the oldest parts of the building are among the oldest buildings in Oxford, and they predate the university by a couple of centuries. And Oxford as a whole is fairly well haunted as it is. So perhaps it's not surprising that there are quite so many ghosts in Oxford Castle, not to mention the fact that it was not only used in warfare, but then became a prison. So there hasn't been a heck of a lot of death happening here. Oxford Castle was built by Norman Baron Robert D'Oyley between 1071 and 1073. Robert had come over with William the Conqueror in his conquest of England in 1066. So if you're unfamiliar with English history, William the Conqueror was a Norman, so Northmen, originally Vikings, but by this point the Normans had settled in northern France, what is now France. And they came over in 1066 and defeated the English King Harold, the Battle of Hastings, and took over the reign of England. There was already a town at Oxford, but it was fairly small. At first, the castle was built as a motte and bailey castle. This is the traditional form of castle building in England in this period, and it consists of a mound with a bailey on top of it, which is essentially the castle keep, and then there's a moat around it, and then there's also an area with people, servants, workers, people who are needed to help run the castle living there, and it's all built out of wood. It was rebuilt in stone in the late 12th or early 13th century, and the Saxon St. George's Tower, which had been built even earlier, around 1020, was then incorporated into the castle. So St. George's Tower is actually even older than the castle itself. It was already there, and the Motte and Bailey Castle was kind of built around it. And then when the Motte and Bailey Castle was rebuilt in stone and expanded, it incorporated St. George's Tower into it. There is also a crypt underneath St. George's Tower, which was rediscovered during excavation work and reconstructed by prisoners when the castle was being used as a prison. And you can see here a diagram of Oxford Castle around the year 1250 CE. So letter A is the keep and motte, B, St. George's Tower and chapel, C is the round tower, D is the river Isis, which is the river that flows through Oxford. This river eventually flows into the Thames. It is essentially an earlier bit of the Thames. Then E is the moat. You can see the city wall and the west gate. One of the famous local legends around the castle relates to the escape of Queen Maud or Queen Matilda during the period known as the Anarchy. So the Anarchy is an English civil war that took place between 1138 and 1153. It's actually the civil war that inspired George R.R. Martin's House of the Dragon, among other things, but the core conflict in House of the Dragon is directly inspired by the Anarchy, in the same way that the core conflict in Game of Thrones was inspired by the Wars of the Roses. So to explain it, we have to go back a little bit. In 1120, King Henry I's heir William was killed in the White Ship disaster, which was what it sounds like. It was a ship that sank. 3 times in the years 1127, 1128 and 1131, Henry made his barons take oaths to support his daughter Matilda's claim to the throne, because Matilda was now his only surviving legitimate child. He had quite a few illegitimate children, but William had been his only legitimate son. So his only legitimate child was now his daughter Matilda, but he was worried that the barons would not support a woman's claim to the throne, so he made them swear 3 times that they would support her. But when he died in 1135, Matilda's cousin Stephen, one of the men who had taken the oath, took the throne instead. So the civil war, known as the Anarchy, was fought between Stephen and Matilda. Matilda is known as Empress Maud or Empress Matilda, a title she got from her first husband, Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, but by this point she was married to her second husband, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. The war was eventually resolved in 1153 when, following the death of his son Eustace, Stephen named Matilda's son Henry, who would later become Henry II, as his heir. Oxford Castle comes into this story during the war. In September 1142, Matilda was besieged in Oxford Castle by Stephen's forces. She eventually escaped a few months later in December, either by sneaking out of a side door or, according to the more interesting local legend, by dressing in white so she couldn't be seen against the snow, climbing down a rope from St. George's Tower and walking across the frozen river, or probably running across the frozen River Isis to escape. So the castle had some military importance early on, but by 1327 it was in poor repair, and by the 1350s it had lost its military importance as well. And by this point the university had become increasingly important in the town as well. It had been founded all the way back in 1096, but gained importance increasingly from about 1167. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the castle started to be used as a jail and a criminal court, as well as a local administrative centre. This included holding assizes there. Assizes are periodic criminal courts hearing serious cases carrying the death penalty or life imprisonment that were part of the UK justice system all the way up until 1972. In 1577, a case of plague broke out during an assize in the castle that became known as the Black Assize. It killed the Lord Lieutenant of Oxfordshire, 2 knights, including Sir Robert D'Oyley, a descendant of the original Sir Robert D'Oyley, who was the founder, 80 gentlemen, and the entire grand jury of the Assize. After this, no more assizes were held at the castle. The Oxford Castle and Prison website says some claimed that the Catholic being put on trial for seditious libel and sentenced to being pilloried at this outbreak at the Black Assize, a man called Roland Jenks, had cursed everybody at the trial. So some local legends blame this horrific outbreak of plague and all these deaths on the curse of the Catholic who was being tried at the time. Meanwhile, the buildings continued to fall into disrepair and some parts were built over. Most of the medieval stonework was demolished in 1649 during the English Civil War. The Second English Civil War, just realised I've already talked about one English Civil War. The civil war that is usually known as the English Civil War, as opposed to the civil war that is usually known as the Anarchy, this is the later one between the Protestant Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads, who want to get rid of the monarchy, and the Catholic monarch, King Charles I, who eventually gets his head chopped off. Oliver Cromwell ruled for a while, but after his death, Charles II eventually came back over and retook the throne, and we became a monarchy again. After this second civil war, the castle was used as a prison. Obviously, it had already been used as a jail and as a court, but now it becomes essentially the local prison. It was extensively rebuilt between 1785 and 1805. The old chapel was demolished, and it was extended in 1876. It was used as a prison all the way up until 1996. So obviously, there was continued extensions and building work, and by the 1990s, it was a modern prison building, and the modern part is now a Malmaison hotel, which is really weird. You can just about see it from my photo here, which is taken from the Historic Heritage site, looking into the fancy hotel. Malmaison is French for bad house. So it's a chain. I don't know why they decided to call their chain Bad House, but it does suit a hotel that's in a former prison. It's very weird. I don't think I want to stay in a former prison. Although, having said that, I have stayed in a hotel that was built over a Roman amphitheatre in Bulgaria, in Sofia, capital city of Bulgaria. I noticed on the website the parts of the prison that were associated with corporal or capital punishment in Oxford are used for staff offices rather than guests' rooms. Whereas when I stayed in the hotel in Sofia, the underground where the Roman remains are, which are the remains of the cells that were underneath the amphitheatre where prisoners and animals would have been kept and then released up into the amphitheatre, that is now a health spa area with a little sauna, and you can get massages. And here are some photos of me enjoying a lovely relaxing time reading a book with plinky plonky music in the background in the cells where prisoners were kept before being put to death in the amphitheatre by wild animals or forced to fight to the death. I think it's another one of those things where because it was longer ago, nobody thinks about it. Whereas because the Oxford prison was used much more recently, people are a bit funnier about sleeping in areas associated with corporal or capital punishment. So, having seen all this history, you might not be surprised to hear that Oxford Castle and Prison is one of the most haunted buildings in the country. One of the most famous and frequently seen ghosts is Queen Matilda herself. According to the Oxford Castle and Prison website, her ghost has been seen many times wearing a white cloak, so this is part of the story. She's wearing white so she can't be seen against the snow, and that's how she made her escape. She apparently once gave a prison guard a shock when he thought he saw a prisoner in an off-limits area, but nobody was missing, and it was in fact Matilda. In 2009, she was declared Britain's most seen ghost. So she is usually seen shimmying down the tower, or running away across the river, or just running around the castle in general in her white cloak. The crypt below the castle tower is apparently haunted by a drunken swearing monk called Brother Bernard. The Oxford Castle and Prison website says that a guide called Bess has not only smelled alcohol in there, but once saw Brother Bernard sitting in a corner, as have many other people. And in fact, when I was on the guided tour, the guide mentioned that this particular corner of the crypt is one of the most haunted areas in the whole country, certainly one of the most haunted areas in Oxford. Brother Bernard in particular is usually seen sitting and drinking and swearing in this corner. And you can see in the photo, here's me standing in the most haunted corner in Oxford. Another tour guide saw a guide dog bark and refused to enter the crypt when they were trying to do a guided tour around it. Another ghost associated with the castle and prison is a man called George Napier. He was executed for treason by being hung, drawn and quartered, and his body parts were put on display, but his head went missing. Supposedly the rest of him rides around Oxford on a phantom horse looking for his head. That one is a bit... that sounds like a combination of a traditional, like, headless horseman story with a prisoner whose head got lost, but that's the story. According to darkoxfordshire.co.uk, prisoners in the 1970s at one point carried out a séance, after which a misty shape was seen climbing a staircase and a guard's dog growled at a shadowy figure. And a guide called Gypsy Boswell once heard a woman laughing inside an empty exhibition cell, according to the Castle and Prison website. But the most famous ghost from Oxford Castle, other than Matilda, is a woman called Mary Blandy. Mary Blandy was executed by hanging in 1752 for poisoning her father with arsenic. She was in her early 30s and possibly had smallpox scars, so she was by now a spinster. If you think about Jane Austen's novels written 50, 60 years later, you've got Charlotte Lucas saying, "I'm 27 years old, I desperately need a husband," and marrying the first awful clergyman that proposes to her. So this is a woman who is past her prime, who is panicking, both she and her father, that she's not going to find a husband. So by this point, her father was offering a very large dowry to anyone who would marry her. She got engaged to a man called William Cranston, but it turned out after they got engaged that Cranston already had a wife and child in Scotland. Cranston claimed the marriage was invalid, but Mary's father was having none of it. He wasn't that desperate that he was going to marry his daughter off to a bigamist. Mary, however, was that desperate. And according to her, Cranston gave her something he claimed was a love filter to give to her father that would make her father like him, Cranston, more. This seems odd. Love potions are normally designed to make you fall in love with the person who gives it to you, but according to Mary, this is what happened. And the idea was her father would like Cranston more and they would be able to get married. It was actually arsenic, and her father slowly died from arsenic poisoning. Mary had been seen putting the powder into her father's tea by some of the servants, and she never denied it. But she always insisted that she thought it was a love potion that would make him like her fiancé more, and that it would not do him any harm, including when she confessed it to her father himself as he was sickening. Arsenic poisoning takes some time to take effect. The method of killing is small amounts of arsenic in tea or food over a prolonged period of time that slowly kills the victim. Mary was arrested and Cranston went into hiding. He died of a mysterious swelling illness not long after Mary's execution. And here you can see in this photograph Mary's cell at Oxford. She was a lady, a member of the upper middle to upper classes, so she has a fancy cell. She was probably hung outside of the prison gates, dressed in black crepe, with her hands tied with black ribbon, and with a white handkerchief over her face. After she died, there was no coffin ready, so she was slung over the shoulder of one of the sheriff's men, exposing her legs, which is very indecent in this period. She became very famous and was the subject of poems, stories, a book, and even a play called The Hanging Tree. And I think this is partly because the crime of parricide seems unusual, because of her defence, that yes, she did it, but she thought it was a love philter, that Cranston had tricked her, that she never intended to harm her father. The fact that that defence isn't terribly convincing, because even in legends and stories of witchcraft, that's not really how love potions work. And of course, the fact that she's a well-off and well-known murderer, which tends to make people famous anyway. Her ghost is said to haunt the castle mound, a figure with a white handkerchief over its face, walking up and down the path to the mound, proclaiming her innocence, which she proclaimed right up until the point where she was hung. Guide Nuala Young told Rob Walters for his Haunted Oxford book that she once saw a figure gliding across the mound just the way she had described it to her tour group, who thought it was something she had put on for them. So she explained to the tour group that this is what was seen, and then actually saw it, but the tour group just thought it was some kind of trick she'd arranged. And according to the Oxford Castle and Prison website, another guide called Mr. Holloway once experienced 2 doors closing with a crash after he had been describing to his tour group how Blandy's face had smallpox scars, which he attributed to her being angry about him insulting her appearance. So that's just a few of the best known stories of ghosts associated with Oxford Castle and Prison. I actually struggled to find a really comprehensive list. There are so many of these stories that each kind of website or book would have a few little bits and pieces or different stories. They would collect a different selection. So if you know of any more ghosts or ghost stories or legends associated with Oxford Castle and Prison, please do let me know in the comments. I would love to try and get together a really comprehensive list of all of the ghosts and ghost stories associated with this site. It's absolutely fascinating and it has such a long history. If you enjoyed this video, do give it a like and subscribe to my channel for myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories and weird and wonderful history in general. Until next time, bye!